It was a quiet Thursday morning in downtown Washington, D.C. The streets were already busy with people moving briskly to start their day. Some were headed to work, while others were rushing to grab their morning coffee. A few cars drove by, their engines humming softly, blending into the background noise of the city. Darius, a well-dressed man in a navy blue suit, stepped out of his car and glanced at the towering buildings around him. The city, with its fast pace and constant movement, felt both familiar and strange to him today. He wasn't just any other office worker, and his appearance suggested that. Darius was used to wearing a suit, but not just for business meetings or presentations. As a special agent with the United States Secret Service, his suit was part of his uniform. Tucked carefully inside his jacket, just near his heart, was his badge, the one that identified him as someone who protected the highest leaders of the nation. It was a symbol of his job, his duty, and his commitment, but no one could see that yet. To the casual observer, he was simply a man in a suit walking down a street. Darius paused for a moment, checking the time on his phone. His schedule was packed today. There was a meeting with his team later, and he had to prepare for a briefing about an important event happening in the coming days. But for now, it was just him and the early morning quiet of the city. The kind of peace before everything would pick up, the kind where everything felt like it could go according to plan. He walked calmly down the sidewalk, his shoes tapping gently against the pavement. He passed by a small group of workers who were chatting as they sipped their coffee, laughing at some lighthearted story. Their conversation barely registered in his mind as he focused on the next part of his day. It was just a typical morning, or so it seemed. As he reached the end of the block, a police car slowed down beside him. The officer inside, a man with a sharp haircut and a serious expression, watched Darius for a moment before rolling down his window. "Hey, can you stop for a second?" the officer called out. Darius turned to face him, a little surprised. He had been walking with a steady pace, not doing anything that might raise suspicion, but the officer's tone was firm. "Is there a problem, officer?" Darius asked politely, not wanting to escalate anything. He had dealt with these situations before, where an officer might ask for a little too much information without any real reason. But he kept his composure, knowing that staying calm would always be the best approach. The officer looked Darius up and down, sizing him up before saying, "You live around here?" It was a strange question. Darius wasn't sure what he meant by it. He didn't have time to answer just yet, though, because the officer was already getting out of his car, walking toward him. Darius wasn't expecting this. He hadn't done anything wrong, and yet here was an officer walking straight toward him. He felt a slight tightening in his chest, but kept his expression neutral. He'd been through tougher situations before, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this interaction might not be as simple as he hoped. Darius stood still as the officer walked toward him, his eyes focused on the man in the uniform. The officer had a serious look on his face, his eyes sharp as he approached. Darius tried to read his expression, wondering what had triggered this sudden stop. He had done nothing wrong, nothing out of the ordinary, and yet here he was, facing a situation that felt uncomfortable. As the officer got closer, Darius could hear the soft sound of his boots tapping against the pavement. It seemed like the world around him had slowed down. Pedestrians moved past them, some of them glancing in their direction, but most didn't pay much attention. It was as if this moment was hidden in plain sight, unnoticed by all but those directly involved. "Can I see some ID?" the officer asked, his voice firm but not unfriendly. Darius nodded, reaching for his wallet in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out slowly, not wanting to make any sudden movements. Inside, he had his regular identification and his official United States Secret Service badge, a small but significant item that confirmed his role in protecting high-ranking officials. It was a piece of metal that carried a lot of weight, but he knew showing it would be the right step here. He opened the wallet and handed the officer his regular ID first. The officer took it and glanced at it quickly, but his expression didn't change. Darius felt a small sense of relief, hoping this was just a routine check, something that would be over soon. But then the officer looked at him with a questioning stare, as though something wasn't adding up. "Where do you work?" the officer asked, still holding the ID in his hand. "I work downtown, just a few blocks away," Darius answered. He didn't want to reveal too much. After all, the details of his job were classified, and he didn't feel the need to explain his position to a stranger on the street. But the officer wasn't letting up. "Is that so?" the officer said, his tone shifting slightly. There was something in the way he said it that made Darius feel uneasy. It was as though the officer wasn't convinced, even though Darius had told him the truth. He didn't know what to make of it, but he kept his cool. The officer's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer. "Step over here for a moment," he ordered, motioning toward the side of the sidewalk. Darius paused, unsure whether to comply. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the situation was starting to feel tense. He had been in tight spots before, but this felt different. It wasn't just the officer's presence. It was the way the crowd had started to gather around them. The way people looked at the scene like it was unfolding right before their eyes. It was a moment that would stick with him. He considered his options, but there was no point in challenging the officer right now. Instead, he nodded and walked over to the side, keeping his hands visible and his posture relaxed. He knew he had to stay calm. That was always the key in situations like this. But as the officer circled around him, Darius couldn't help but wonder what was going to happen next. Darius stood on the sidewalk, his hands relaxed by his sides as the officer circled him. He could feel the eyes of pedestrians on him, some stopping to watch, others quickening their pace to move on. The quiet hum of the city seemed to grow distant, replaced by the sharp sound of the officer's footsteps as he paced around Darius. Everything about this situation felt wrong, and Darius couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get worse. The officer stopped directly in front of him, his gaze cold and focused. "You're not telling me everything," the officer said, his voice sharper now. Darius's mind raced, trying to understand what had changed. He had shown the officer his ID, had answered his questions. Nothing about this situation seemed unusual. At least, it hadn't been until now. "I told you the truth," Darius replied, trying to stay calm. He had nothing to hide, but the officer's suspicion was growing, and Darius felt that unease creeping back into his thoughts. What was the officer looking for? Why wasn't he convinced? The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped back a few paces, his hand hovering near his sidearm. Darius noticed this and felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that something was wrong now, something was escalating, and he didn't know how to stop it. His training kicked in, reminding him to stay composed, to avoid making any sudden movements. He had been in tense situations before, but this felt different. The officer seemed to be on edge, as though he was waiting for something to happen. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," the officer ordered suddenly, his voice forceful. Darius blinked in surprise. This was a step far beyond what he had expected. He could feel the blood rush to his head, his heart beating faster now. He wasn't used to being treated like this. Not ever. For a brief moment, Darius considered whether to comply. But he knew that resisting would only make things worse. So with a slow and deliberate movement, he turned and placed his hands on the hood of the car as the officer had instructed. He could feel the heat of the metal through his suit, and he tried to steady his breath. "What's going on?" Darius asked, his voice steady but laced with confusion. He had never been in a situation where he had to answer for his identity like this. Everything about it felt off. The officer didn't respond. Instead, Darius heard him muttering under his breath, words that were hard to make out, but filled with frustration. It was clear that the officer wasn't buying the story, that he wasn't convinced by the ID or by the simple explanations Darius had given. "Last chance," the officer said, his voice now cold and final. "If you don't tell me the truth, things are going to get a lot more complicated." Darius could feel the weight of the words pressing down on him, the seriousness of the officer's tone. He knew he had no choice now. From the corner of his eye, he saw a few people glance toward them, whispers starting to spread through the small crowd. It was only a matter of time before others noticed the tension between them. But in that moment, Darius had one card left to play. And it wasn't something the officer would expect. Darius could feel the officer's eyes on him as he stood with his hands on the hood of the car. The air between them was tense, the silence stretching out longer than it should have. With each passing second, Darius could sense the officer's growing frustration, his patience wearing thin. It was clear the officer didn't believe him, didn't trust his story. But Darius knew that staying calm and collected was the only way out of this situation. In that moment, Darius's mind raced. He needed to act fast. Pulling the wrong card could make everything worse. But he had to do something. Something that would stop this before it escalated any further. With a deep breath, he slowly reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out the small metal badge he had kept hidden. He held it in his hand, close to his body, hoping the officer wouldn't see it yet. The officer continued to stand behind him, still waiting, still uncertain. Darius turned slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of the officer's face in the corner of his eye. His grip tightened on the badge, and with a slow motion, he turned enough to reveal it. "This is why I'm here," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm with the United States Secret Service." The officer's eyes narrowed as he looked at the badge. He blinked, his expression changing from suspicion to disbelief. For a long moment, there was no sound, just the soft rustle of the city around them. Darius kept his gaze steady, knowing that this was the turning point. The officer had to believe him now. "You're kidding," the officer muttered, shaking his head as though he couldn't process what he was seeing. "You're with the Secret Service." His voice was a mix of confusion and doubt. Darius nodded, his hand still holding the badge out in front of him. "Yes, I'm on assignment here." "You've got the wrong person," he said, his tone soft but unwavering. The officer's expression shifted once more, from disbelief to something that looked a lot like embarrassment. At that moment, a black SUV pulled up to the curb, the sound of tires on pavement cutting through the tension in the air. Two men in suits stepped out of the vehicle, moving quickly and purposefully toward the scene. Darius recognized them immediately. They were part of his team, his security detail, trained for situations just like this. The officer stood frozen as one of the men approached him, showing his own credentials, a badge that made the officer's eyes widen. "Stand down," the agent ordered, his voice cold and commanding. The officer didn't move at first, still staring at the badge in Darius's hand. But as the second agent approached, the officer slowly lowered his gun, his body language now filled with hesitation. The situation, which had seemed like it could spiral out of control in an instant, was suddenly under control. Darius's team had arrived, and the officer's confusion was clear. The agent who had spoken to the officer looked at him with a stern expression. "You're going to need to explain yourself," the agent said quietly, his voice filled with authority. The officer swallowed, nodding silently, his earlier bravado completely gone. Darius stood to the side, his hands still at his sides, watching as his colleagues took charge of the situation. He didn't need to say another word. The story had shifted, and the power had shifted with it. The officer stood still, his eyes glued to the badge in Darius's hand, disbelief still written on his face. Darius could feel the weight of the situation shift in an instant. The tension in the air seemed to melt away, replaced by a quiet but heavy realization. The officer had made a mistake, a big one, and now the truth was staring him in the face. The two agents who had arrived weren't just random people. They were Darius's colleagues, part of the Secret Service, trained to handle situations just like this. One of the agents stepped forward and spoke directly to the officer, his voice firm but controlled. "This man is a special agent with the United States Secret Service. He's here on assignment," he said, showing his own badge to back up the statement. The officer's eyes flicked between the two agents and Darius, still processing what he was hearing. "You're telling me this is real?" the officer asked, his voice shaky now. The second agent nodded, confirming everything with a calm demeanor that only made the officer look more uncertain. It was clear now that the badge wasn't something Darius had bought or faked. It was the real thing, and there was no denying it. "Yes," the agent replied, his tone growing more serious. "He's with us. And you need to explain yourself." The officer stood frozen for a moment, as though he didn't know what to do next. He had been so sure, so confident in his own judgment just moments before. Now that certainty was gone. His hand, which had once been resting near his weapon, slowly dropped to his side. He looked down at the ground, unable to meet the eyes of the agents or Darius. The silence stretched between them, the realization of his mistake hanging heavily in the air. Darius didn't say anything. He didn't need to. There was nothing more to add. Everything had already been said with the display of his badge and the arrival of his team. He watched as the officer's posture shifted, the arrogance and suspicion that had been so clear just moments ago replaced with something more like shame. The officer opened his mouth as though to say something, but no words came out. The first agent turned his attention back to Darius. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked, his voice professional, but with a hint of concern. Darius nodded, his face still calm. "Yes, I'm fine," he replied quietly. He had been in situations like this before. Situations where someone questioned his identity or challenged his authority. It wasn't new, and it wasn't personal. It was just part of the job. The second agent glanced at the officer, then back to Darius. "You're not hurt?" he asked again. Darius shook his head. "No, but I'll file a report about this later," he said. His voice was steady, showing that he was in control of the situation. Even though things had nearly spiraled out of hand, it was clear that Darius had handled it with professionalism, just as he had been trained to do. The officer, still standing awkwardly to the side, was now being quietly addressed by the agents. Darius didn't need to watch anymore. He had done his part. His badge had spoken for him, and now the consequences of the officer's actions would unfold in their own time. All he needed to do now was move on with his day, though he knew this moment would stick with him. It was a reminder that things weren't always as simple as they seemed, and that sometimes authority needed to be backed up with more than just words. As the situation began to settle, Darius took a step back, watching quietly as his two colleagues spoke with the officer. The tension in the air had almost completely dissipated, but Darius could feel the weight of the encounter lingering. The officer's earlier arrogance was now replaced with hesitation, as though he was still trying to process the mistake he had made. The first agent, who had spoken the most to the officer, was now writing something down in a small notebook. Darius knew that it wasn't just a casual note. It was likely a record of the officer's actions, something that would come back later. The officer had overstepped in a big way, and there were always consequences for actions like that, especially when it came to people in Darius's line of work. Meanwhile, the second agent had taken a few steps back, standing guard near the black SUV that had arrived. He didn't speak, but his watchful gaze made it clear that he was keeping an eye on everything around them. Darius appreciated the level of caution. His team was always on alert, no matter how small the threat seemed. Security wasn't something you took lightly, especially in a city as unpredictable as Washington. Darius glanced at the officer one last time. The man had his head down now, his shoulders slumped, looking like someone who knew he'd made a serious error. The officer had been so quick to judge, so sure that Darius wasn't who he said he was. It wasn't just about the badge. It was about trust, and the officer had broken that trust in a very public way. As the first agent finished taking his notes, he looked up and nodded at the second agent, signaling that it was time to move on. Darius, still standing off to the side, felt the rush of relief he'd been holding back. It was over. The officer's mistake had been acknowledged, and now everything would return to normal. The agent started walking back toward the SUV, their eyes scanning the surroundings. The car door opened, and Darius stepped inside, followed by the two agents. "You handled that well," the first agent said, his voice calm but appreciative. Darius nodded, his expression neutral. "It wasn't exactly how I planned it," he said quietly, glancing out of the window. "But sometimes, you just have to let things play out." "It's part of the job," the second agent added, his tone matter-of-fact. "We've all been there." Darius leaned back in his seat, his mind replaying the events of the morning. The officer's doubt, the way everything had almost spiraled out of control, and the relief that had followed when his team arrived. It had been a close call, but it was one of those moments that would remind him to always be prepared, to never let his guard down, no matter how routine things seemed. As the SUV pulled away from the scene, Darius looked ahead, focusing on the next part of his day. There was always something more to do, always another task waiting. But this moment would stay with him. It was a reminder of the unpredictable nature of his work, and how quickly things could change. One moment everything was fine, and the next, everything could shift. But he was ready for whatever came next. The SUV hummed steadily as it made its way through the busy streets, the sounds of the city fading into the background. Darius sat quietly in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the view outside. The events of the morning replayed in his mind. It hadn't been an ordinary encounter, and it wasn't something he could easily forget. The officer's reaction, the doubt, the tension, it all felt like a blur now. But in the quiet of the car, it was clear to him that this was a moment he needed to reflect on. He thought about how quickly things could change. Just minutes ago, he had been going about his day, following the routine, and then out of nowhere, everything had shifted. One simple question from a stranger had escalated into something much bigger. Darius had always known that his job required quick thinking, but today had reminded him just how unpredictable life could be. The agent sitting next to him glanced at Darius, sensing his quiet mood. "You okay?" he asked, his voice calm. Darius turned his head slightly, giving the agent a small nod. "Yeah, just thinking," he replied softly. "It could have gone a lot differently, couldn't it?" The agent paused, then nodded in agreement. "It could have, but you handled it well. Not everyone would have stayed as calm as you did." Darius didn't respond immediately. He appreciated the compliment, but it didn't fully ease the weight he felt. In his line of work, the unexpected was always just around the corner. And that made him think. Had he done everything right? Could he have prevented the officer's mistake in some way? The SUV slowed as they approached a traffic light. Darius watched the people walking on the sidewalks, oblivious to what had just happened. The world outside seemed so normal, as if nothing had interrupted the flow of the city. But inside the vehicle, things felt different. He was reminded that no matter how ordinary a day seemed, there was always the potential for something to turn in a new direction. His mind shifted to his role in the Secret Service, the duty he held to protect and serve. It wasn't always easy, and moments like this made him realize just how important his work was. He couldn't let his guard down, not for a second. There were always people who would challenge his authority, who would question his presence, and while most of the time everything went smoothly, today had proven that things could quickly spiral if he wasn't prepared. The car turned a corner, and Darius's thoughts focused once again on the bigger picture. The officer had made a mistake, but it wasn't just about the officer. It was about the system, the trust, and the responsibility he carried with every step he took. He had a job to do, a purpose to fulfill, and that was something he couldn't forget, no matter how small the challenge seemed. As the SUV continued on its route, Darius let out a quiet breath. The events of the day had shaken him, but they had also reminded him why he did what he did. He was ready for whatever came next. Life might be unpredictable, but he had learned long ago to face it with steadiness, to meet every challenge head-on. And with that, he settled back into his seat, ready to take on whatever the rest of the day would bring. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Darius had returned to his office, where the hum of the air conditioning and the soft tap of his keyboard became the background to his thoughts. His morning had started with a routine check, an ordinary task he'd done countless times before. Yet, in just a matter of moments, everything had changed. As he sat at his desk, reviewing the reports that had piled up, Darius couldn't help but reflect on the events of the morning. It was strange how quickly things could turn from normal to chaotic. One moment, he had been minding his own business, and the next, he was faced with a tense standoff with an officer who had doubted his identity. But despite how unsettling the experience had been, Darius knew he had done what was necessary to prevent things from escalating further. His actions had been calm and measured, just as he had been trained to do. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was already late afternoon, and the building around him had started to quiet down. The usual rush of people running in and out of the halls had slowed. Most of his colleagues had already wrapped up their work for the day and headed home. Darius, however, remained at his desk, his focus still on the task at hand. There was always more to do, always another mission waiting to be completed. Just as he was about to stand up and stretch, there was a soft knock at the door. Darius looked up to see one of his agents standing in the doorway, a folder in his hand. "Sir, we've got an update," the agent said. Darius nodded and gestured for him to come in. The agent stepped forward and handed over the folder, which contained the details of the officer's situation. "We've received the report from Internal Affairs," the agent continued. "The officer is being reprimanded for his actions. A formal review is underway." Darius took the folder and skimmed through the contents. The officer would likely face consequences for how he had handled the situation, but Darius wasn't concerned about that. What mattered most to him was that the situation had been diffused without anyone getting hurt, without things getting out of control. "Good," Darius said, setting the folder aside. He glanced at the agent, his expression unreadable. "Make sure everything is documented. We don't want any loose ends." The agent nodded and left the room, leaving Darius alone once again. Sitting back in his chair, Darius allowed himself a moment of quiet. The events of the morning felt distant now, almost like they belonged to another day. He had done what he needed to do, and now it was time to move on. He had learned something valuable from the experience. Even in a city like Washington, things could change in an instant, and it was up to him to stay prepared, to stay sharp. With a deep breath, Darius turned his attention back to his work. The rest of the day would pass as it always did, with a steady stream of tasks to manage. But in the back of his mind, he knew that today's events would stick with him. They would be a reminder of the unpredictable nature of life, and the need to remain calm and focused, no matter what came next.